Nobody spoke for what felt like an eternity. Yuna stood inside the barrier and let the trembling in her limbs slowly subside while 11 alien students stared at her as if she had transformed into something entirely new. Zurel moved first, the small Ethone rushed forward and her bioluminescent body blazed with colors Yuna had never seen before. "You are alive," Cyril whispered, and her voice cracked with emotion. "You walked out there, and it was right there, and you are alive." "I am alive," Yuna confirmed, and the words felt strange in her mouth, as if she needed to convince herself as much as anyone else. Meraxi slithered closer, and her yellow eyes studied Yuna with the intensity of someone witnessing a scientific impossibility. "I recorded everything," the villain said. "Every moment from the second you stepped outside until you returned. And I have watched many documentaries about Deathworld species, but I have never seen anything like what you just did." "What exactly did I do?" Yuna asked, and she was genuinely curious how her actions had appeared to alien eyes. "You refuse to be prey," Meraxi said. "The Skethrix is one of the most effective predators in this sector of the galaxy, and its hunting success rate exceeds 90%. And it has killed creatures far larger and stronger than you, and you simply decided that you would not allow it to hunt you." Torvin approached, and his massive frame seemed somehow smaller than before. The Garati, who had mocked her weakness now, looked at her with something that might have been shame. "I spoke poorly of your species," he said, and the words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "I said humans survived through luck, and I was wrong, and what I witnessed tonight was not luck." "No," Yuna agreed, "it was not." "What was it then?" Yuna considered the question while she wiped the chemical paste from her skin with a cloth. Valorith offered her. 200,000 years ago, my ancestors lived on a planet where everything wanted to kill them," she said. "They had no claws and no armor and no venom, and they were slower than the predators that hunted them and weaker than the prey they needed to eat. And by every logical measure, they should have gone extinct." She paused and looked at the tree line where the Skethrix had vanished in pursuit of her. "Decoy, but they did not go extinct," she continued. "They survived, and they survived because they learned to think differently, and they learned to understand predators instead of just fearing them, and they learned to become something that predators could not categorize." "You made yourself strange," Cyril said with sudden understanding. "You made yourself into something the Skethrix had never encountered before." "Exactly," Yuna said. "A predator's instincts are designed to handle prey that follows predictable patterns. And when you break those patterns, you create confusion, and confusion creates hesitation, and hesitation creates opportunity." Valarith stepped forward, and his clicking voice was uncharacteristically soft. "I have been an instructor for 40 cycles," he said. "I have studied xenobiology across 100 worlds, and I have taught thousands of students from dozens of species, and I thought I understood what Deathworlder meant." He paused, and his compound eyes fixed on Yuna with an expression she could not quite interpret. "I did not understand," he admitted. "The databases describe Deathworld species as physically robust and adapted to harsh conditions, and they emphasize durability and strength and environmental tolerance. And none of that describes what you did tonight." "What do you think it describes?" Yuna asked. "Cognitive adaptation," Valorith said slowly. "Your species did not evolve to survive through physical superiority, and you evolved to survive through psychological flexibility and the ability to think your way around problems that should have been impossible." Meraxi nodded eagerly. "This must be documented for the Academy," she said. "The implications for interspecies relations are enormous, and we have been evaluating humans based on the wrong criteria entirely." "What criteria should you have been using?" Torvin asked. "Fear management," Meraxi said. "Problem solving under pressure, and the capacity to remain functional when every instinct demands panic. And these are the true markers of a Deathworld. Species and physical attributes are secondary." Yuna listened to their discussion with a strange mixture of pride and exhaustion. She had spent 6 months at the academy being underestimated and dismissed, and treated as a curiosity at best and a primitive newcomer at worst. Tonight had changed something fundamental in how these aliens perceived her, and perhaps how they would perceive. All of Humanivisceral moved to stand beside her, and the Ethony's glow had settled into a warm, steady amber. "May I ask you one more question?" Cyril said. "Of course. You told Instructor Valorith that you were terrified," Cyril said. "I could see your hand shaking when you returned, and I know that you felt fear throughout the entire encounter, and yet you went anyway, and you succeeded anyway." "Yes. How?" Cyril asked, and the question seemed to contain everything she could not put into words. "How? Do you feel fear and not obey it?" Yuna thought about her ancestors again, and the long chain of survivors that stretched back to the first humans who had looked at a world full of predators and decided they would not be victims. "Fear is information," she said finally. "It tells you that something is dangerous, and it does not tell you that something is impossible." And on Earth we learn to listen to fear without letting it make our decisions. She looked at the barrier and the darkness beyond. Every human alive today is descended from people who felt fear and acted anyway, she said. The ones who let fear control them did not survive long enough to become our ancestors, and we are the children of the stubborn ones and the clever ones and the ones who refused to die. The shuttle arrived at dawn. Ion storm had passed and the transport descended through clear, amber skies to collect the students as they boarded. Yuna noticed that the other students looked at her differently than before. There was respect in their eyes now, and something else that might have been caution. She had shown them what a human could do, and they would not forget. Cyril sat beside her for the flight back to the academy, and the small Ethony's glow pulsed with quiet contentment. "I'm glad I met you," Cyril said. "I think you have changed how I see the galaxy." "How so?" "I used to think that strength meant being powerful enough to win fights," Cyril said. "Now I think strength means being able to face things that terrify you and find a way through anyway." Yuna smiled and looked out the window at the silver forests of Verdaxis 7 falling away below them. "That is exactly what strength means," she said. "And every human knows it because our whole history has been the story of people who found ways through impossible situations." Cyril was quiet for a moment. "Do all humans carry that knowledge?" she asked. "Could any of your people have done what you did?" Yuna considered the question carefully. "Every human carries the memory of ancestors who refused to die," she said. "Some of us remember it more clearly than others, but it is always there. And when we need it most, it wakes up and reminds us what we are capable of." The shuttle climbed higher and the planet became a swirl of silver and gold and purple below them somewhere. Down there, a Skethrix was hunting through the forests and wondering what strange creature had wandered into its territory and refused to be prey. It would never find an answer. Some things could not be understood by predators who had never faced something like humanity. And that was exactly how humans had survived for 200,000 years. Not by being the strongest, not by being the fastest, but by being the one thing that predators never expected, something that looked like prey, but thought like a hunter, something that felt fear but chose its own response, something utterly and magnificently human. The night air was cold against Yuna's skin, and the chemical paste she had applied made her smell like nothing that ever existed on this world. She stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats and let her eyes adjust to the darkness beyond. The barrier's glow 40 meters separated her from the power, coupling 40 meters of open ground where a 6-limbed predator waited to kill her. The Skethrix rose from its crouch and began moving toward her with fluid, deadly grace. Yuna did not run. She took 1 step forward and then another, and kept her pace steady and calm. Inside the barrier she could hear Cyril whimpering and someone else praying in a language she did not understand. She blocked out the sounds and focused entirely on the creature. Approaching her, the Skethrix stopped 10 meters away and studied her with obvious confusion. Its thermal vision showed something wrong with this prey. Instead of a single warm body-shaped target, it saw scattered fragments of heat in patterns that made no biological sense. The chemical scent was equally baffling. Nothing on Verdaxis 7 smelled like this strange combination of compounds, and the creature's instincts could not categorize what stood before it. Yuna watched the predator's body language shift from confident approach to uncertain assessment. She continued walking, one step, and then another, and then another. The Skethrix circled to her left, and she turned her head to maintain eye contact. Every survival instinct in her body screamed at her to look away and to submit, and to show this apex predator that she was not a threat. She ignored those instincts on Earth. Her ancestors had learned that some predators interpreted eye contact as a challenge, and backing down invited attack. She did not know which category the Skethrix fell into, but she had made her choice, and she would commit to it completely. The creature stopped circling and faced her directly 20 meters to the coupling. Now Yuna kept walking. The Skethrix made a sound deep in its throat, and the noise was somewhere between a growl and a question. It had never encountered prey like this. Prey ran, or prey froze, or prey fought with desperate futile aggression. Prey did not simply walk past a predator as if the predator did not exist. Yuna felt sweat running down her back, despite the cold air, and her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained calm and her steps remained steady. She was not prey. She refused to be prey. She was something the Skethrix had no category for, and she intended to remain that way until she reached the coupling 15 meters. The predator lunged forward in a test and stopped just short of striking distance. Yuna stopped as well. She turned to face the creature fully and stared directly into its glowing orange eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The Skethrix tilted its head and studied her with an expression that might have been frustration. This was not how the hunt was supposed to work. Yuna resumed walking, and the predator did not follow immediately. It hung back and watched and tried to understand what it was dealing with. 10 meters to the coupling, the power coupling was a cylindrical unit attached to a bank of solar collectors, and even in the dim starlight, Yuna could see the damage something had chewed through the main cable, and the Skethrix must have done this deliberately to disable the barrier. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. This creature had planned the attack and had disabled their defenses before revealing itself. She had been right to treat it as an intelligent adversary rather than a simple animal. Yuna reached the coupling and knelt beside it. She kept the Skethrix in her peripheral vision as she examined the damage. The repair would require both hands and her full attention, and she would be vulnerable for at least 2 minutes. The predator began circling again, and this time it moved closer, 5 meters away, and then 4, and then 3. Yuna could smell it now, and the scent was musky and sharp with undertones of old blood. She began the repairs. Her hands moved quickly and connected wires and rerouted power, and her training on Earth had included basic electronics, because humans learned to fix things or they died when things broke at the wrong moment. The Skethrix crouched low, and its muscles tensed for a spring. Yuna recognized the posture. The creature had made its decision. It would attack. She had perhaps 2 seconds. In one fluid motion, she spun and activated the modified scanner at maximum intensity. Light and sound exploded from the device in a burst calibrated specifically for the Skethrix's sensory range. The creature screamed, and the sound was horrible and alien and full of pain. It stumbled backward and pawed at its eyes, and its echolocation was useless against the ringing that filled its skull. Yuna grabbed her decoy bundle and threw it with all her strength toward the distant tree line. The heat blanket activated on impact, and suddenly there was a warm prey-shaped signature fleeing into the forest and leaking the chemical smell of fear and injury. Skethrix's hunting instincts overwhelmed its confusion. Prey was running. Prey was injured. Prey must Lee caught the creature abandoned Yuna and charged after the decoy with all 6 limbs. Churning against the ground, Yuna turned back to the coupling and forced her shaking hands to complete the repair. She connected the final wire and heard the barrier hum back to full power. For a long moment, she simply knelt there and breathed. Her whole body trembled with the release of tension, and her vision blurred with tears she had not allowed herself to shed. She had done it. She had walked into the hunting ground of an apex predator, and she had won. The Skethrix would discover that its prey was nothing but fabric and chemicals, and by then, Yuna would be safely behind the barrier. She stood on legs that felt like water and walked back toward the camp inside. The barrier 11 aliens stood in perfect silence and watched her approach with expressions she could not read. Cyril's bioluminescence blazed with brilliant white lighterons. 4 arms hung limp at his sides. Meraxi had pressed herself against the barrier as if trying to get as close to Yuna as possible. Ovlad's compound eyes reflected the restored camp lights, and his antennae stood straight up, and what she had learned was an expression of profound shock. Yuna stepped through the barrier and felt the familiar tingle of the energy field against her skin. She was safe. She was alive, and based on the faces around her, she had just shattered everything these aliens thought they knew about humanity. The barrier flickered again, and this time it took several seconds to stabilize. Yuna watched the power fluctuation and made her decision. "I'm going to fix the coupling," she announced. Words fell into a silence so complete that she could hear the Skethrix breathing outside the barrier. Then chaos erupted. "Absolutely not," Belarth said with sharp clicking sounds. "I forbid it, and as your instructor, I will not allow a student to sacrifice themselves." "She has lost her mind," Torvin said. "The human wants to die. Yuna, please," Cyril begged, and her bioluminescence pulsed with desperate blue light. "You cannot go out there." Yuna waited for the noise to settle before she spoke again. "The barrier will fail in less than 15 minutes now. And when it does, the Skethrix will have access to all of us, and how many of you can outrun it?" Silence answered her. "How many of you can fight it?" More silence. "I am not planning to sacrifice myself," Yuna continued. "I am planning to survive, and I need your help to do it." Meraxi slithered closer, and her yellow eyes studied Yuna with intense curiosity. "What exactly do you intend to do?" the Villain asked. "The Skethrix hunts through thermal vision and fear response," Yuna said. "If I can mask my heat signature and refuse to act like prey, then I can confuse it long enough to reach the coupling." "That is insane," Torvin growled. "You cannot simply choose not to be prey. Humans have been doing exactly that for 200,000 years. Yuna replied, "We did not survive Earth by being stronger or faster than our predators, and we survived by being smarter and stranger." She turned to Meraxi. "I need the chemical compounds from our sample collection kits, and specifically anything with a strong, unfamiliar scent that might confuse the creature's sensors." Meraxi hesitated only a moment before retrieving the requested supplicity. Yuna sorted through the containers and selected several compounds that smelled sharp and foreign. She began mixing them into a paste that she spread across her exposed skin, and the scent was overwhelming and unpleasant, but it would mask her natural chemical signature. "Cyril," she said next, "I need your emergency heat blanket." The small Ethone handed over the silvery thermal blanket. With trembling hands, Yuna wrapped it around her torso in an unusual configuration that broke up her body's heat signature into confusing patterns. From a distance, she would appear as multiple small heat sources rather than a single prey-sized target. "Torvin," she continued, "I need your scanning unit." The Garati hesitated. "What could you possibly need that for?" "The scanning unit has a maximum intensity setting for penetrating dense materials," Yuna explained. "If I configure it correctly, I can produce a burst of light and sound that will overwhelm the Skethrix's thermal vision and echolocation." "You want to blind it," Meraxi said with growing understanding. "Temporarily, yes, and that should give me the opening I need. Torvin handed over the scanner with obvious reluctance. Una made the necessary adjustments and then began assembling one final component. She took the remaining heat blanket and wrapped it around a bundle of fabric soaked in the chemical compounds and added a small heating element from the emergency kit. What is that? Cyril asked. A decoy, Una said. It will read as warm and smell like injured prey. And if everything goes wrong, this will give the Skethrics something else to chase. She stood and faced her classmates. 11 alien faces stared back at her with expressions ranging from terror to disbelief to something that might have been awe. On Earth we had a saying, Una told them. You do not have to be faster than the predator. And you only have to be stranger than anything it has ever hunted before. The Lorith stepped forward, and his compound eyes reflected the dim emergency lights. I have been teaching xenobiology for 40 cycles. He said, I have led hundreds of expeditions and trained thousands of students, and never once has anyone proposed walking into the jaws of an apex predator on purpose. Is that your way of saying I should not do this? It is my way of saying that if you somehow survive, I will need to completely revise my understanding of Deathworld species. Una almost smiled. I will do my best to give you interesting new data. She moved toward the barrier's edge, and every step felt heavier than the last. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands trembled. Slightly despite her best efforts to control them, fear was screaming through every nerve in her body and telling her to hide, and to stay where it was safe, and to let someone else take this risk. But fear had never controlled humans. Humans had learned to listen to fear and understand it, and then do what needed to be done anyway. That was the difference between prey and something else entirely. Una Cyril called out, and her voice was barely a whisper. Are you not afraid? Una paused at the barriers edge and looked back at the glowing Ethone. I am terrified, she admitted. But fear is just information, and it tells me that this is dangerous, and it does not tell me that this is impossible. She turned to face the darkness outside. The Skethrics had stopped circling, and now it crouched at the far end of the clearing and watched her with predatory focus. It knew something had changed. It could sense that one of the prey was behaving differently. When I step outside, Una said without looking back, nobody follow me, and nobody call out to me, and nobody do anything that might distract me or draw the creature's attention, and just stay quiet and trust that I know what I am doing. And if you do not know what you are doing, Torvin asked, then you will have an interesting story to tell when the shuttle arrives. Una took a deep breath and held it for a moment and let it out slowly. Her ancestors had faced lions and wolves and bears with nothing but sharpened sticks and clever minds. They had survived ice ages and famines and plagues and extinction events that had destroyed countless other species. They had clawed their way to the top of a Deathworld's food chain through sheer stubborn refusal to die. She was the inheritor of that legacy. She carried 200,000 years of survival in her blood and bones and brain. One alien predator would not be the thing that ended her story. Una stepped through the barrier and into the hunting ground of the Skethrics. The twin suns had vanished below the horizon, and the silver forest had transformed into a maze of shadows and whispers. Una stood at the barrier's edge and watched the darkness while her classmates huddled near the central shelter. Instructor Velarth had been speaking quietly into his communicator for several minutes, and when he finally turned to address the group, his antennae lay flat with barely contained alarm. I must be honest with all of you, he said, and his clicking voice carried a weight that silenced every murmur. The containment breach is confirmed, and we have a situation that requires your complete cooperation. Cyril's bioluminescence flickered rapidly, and the small Ethone pressed closer to Meraxi for comfort. What exactly? As breach containment, Meraxi asked with forced calm. Velareth took a moment before answering. A Skethrics, he said. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Several students gasped, and two of the smaller ones fled into the shelter with cries. Of terror, even Torvin's confident posture faltered, and his four hands clenched into uncertain fists. Juna had never heard of a Skethrix, but the fear on every alien face told her everything she needed to know. For our human student who may not be familiar, Valorith continued, the Skethrix is one of Verdaxis 7's apex predators, and it is a six-limbed pack hunter with thermal vision and paralytic venom and intelligence, comparable to the most cunning predators in the known galaxy. Comparable to what on my world? Yuna asked. Valorith considered the question. Your Terran wolves perhaps, but larger and more patient and capable of problem-solving that borders on sapient. Yuna nodded slowly and filed the information away. Does it hunt alone? Or in groups? She asked. Typically in packs of 4 to 6, but our sensors show only a single male has entered our zone, and he appears to be a young adult likely driven from his pack and searching for new territory. Hunting patterns. Valorith's compound eyes fixed on her with surprise. You ask very specific questions, human. I want to understand what we are dealing with. Yuna said simply, the Skethrix is an ambush predator. Valorith explained, it stalks its prey and waits for the moment of maximum fear before striking, and its venom paralyzes victims within seconds, and the prey remains conscious while being consumed. Cyril made a sound of pure terror, and her glow went completely dark. Can we call the shuttle for emergency extraction? Torvin demanded, and his earlier bravado had vanished. Entar Liveloth shook his head. An ion storm is passing through the upper atmosphere, and shuttle travel is impossible for at least 6 hours. And we must shelter in place until dawn. The barrier will protect us, Meraxi said, but her voice held a question rather than a statement. The barrier is designed to deter a curious wildlife, not to withstand a determined apex predator, Valorith admitted. However, if we remain calm and quiet, we should avoid attracting its attention, and in the morning, we will evacuate safely. Yuna studied the barrier's shimmer and noted how the energy field fluctuated slightly at certain points. What powers the barrier? She asked. A central coupling connected to solar collectors, Valorith said. Why do you ask? Before Yuna could answer, the camp lights flickered once and then died completely. Darkness swallowed them, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of the barrier and the stars overhead. Students screamed and stumbled in the blackness, and Valorith's voice rose above the chaos, demanding calm. Something has damaged the power coupling, he announced. Everyone remain still, and I will activate emergency lighting. Dim red lights flickered to life along the ground and cast everything in bloody shadow. Yuna's eyes adjusted quickly, and she scanned the tree line with the focus of someone who had grown up, knowing that darkness hid dangers. She saw it almost immediately at the edge of the light. Where the silver trees met the open ground, a shape moved with fluid predatory gray. 6 limbs carried a body the size of a large horse, and its hide was dark and modeled for perfect camouflage in the shadows. 2 large eyes reflected the emergency lights with an orange glow, and below them a mouth filled with curved teeth opened slightly as if tasting the air. The Skethrix had found them. Nobody move, Valorith whispered. Do not run and do not make sudden movements. The students froze, and Yuna could hear the rapid breathing of a dozen terrified aliens. The Skethrix circled the camp's perimeter and tested the barrier with careful touches of its clawed limbs. Where its body contacted the energy field, sparks flew, and the creature retreated. But it did not leave. Instead, it watched them with patient, calculating intelligence. It knows the barrier is weakening, Meraxi whispered with horror. It can see the fluctuations, and it is waiting. Yuna watched the predator study them, and she recognized the look in its eyes. She had seen that same patient hunger in the eyes of wolves and big cats and every other predator she had learned about during her survival training on Earth. This creature was smart, and it knew that time was on its side. How long until the barrier fails completely? Yuna asked Valorith, checked his communicator with shaking hands. 20 minutes. Perhaps less, and the power coupling must be repaired, or we will be completely exposed. Where's the coupling? 40 meters. Outside the barrier near the main solar collectors, Valorith said. But attempting to reach it would be suicide, and the Skethrix would strike before anyone could complete the repairs. Torvin flexed his forearms and tried to summon his earlier confidence. I will go, he declared. My hide can withstand some damage, and I am the strongest among us. The Skethrix chose that moment to lunge at the barrier directly in front of Torunth. Energy field held but barely, and the massive Garati stumbled backward with a cry of shock. His courage shattered in that instant, and he retreated to huddle with the other students. He watched the predator return to its patient circling, and she began to think every predator had patterns, and every pattern had weaknesses. She had learned this truth in the forests and mountains of Earth, where her ancestors had survived against creatures far more powerful than themselves. The Skethrix was an ambush predator that relied on fear and the flight response of its prey, expected them to panic and run and make mistakes. What would happen if someone refused to follow that script? Instructor Valorith, Una said calmly. I need you to tell me everything about the Skethrix's hunting behavior, and I need the information now. The alien professor stared at her with disbelief, but something in her steady voice made him answer. It tracks prey through thermal vision and chemical sensors, and it waits for signs of fear, which trigger its attack response, and once prey begins to flee, the hunt becomes inevitable. What confuses it? Una pressed. What makes it hesitate? Valorith paused. I do not understand the question. Every predator has things that make it uncertain, Una explained. Prey that does not act like prey, and situations it has never encountered, and I need to know what makes the Skethrix stop and think instead of attack. The alien students watched this exchange with growing confusion, and Meraxi's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. You are planning something, the Vithalan say. Una did not answer, but her eyes remained fixed on the prowling Skethrix. She was already calculating distances and timing, and the supply she would need 20 minutes was not much time, but it would have to be enough. The shuttle descended through the amber clouds of Verdaxis 7, and Una Park pressed her face against the observation window to watch the alien forest grow larger beneath them. She had never seen trees with silver leaves before, and the way they swayed in the wind made them look like waves on a metal ocean. Around her sat 11 alien students from the Galactic Academy of Interspecies Studies, and not one of them shared her excitement. The Ethoni student named Cyril sat in the corner with her fragile, translucent body curled into a protective ball, and her bioluminescent patches flickered with nervous blue light. Beside her, the massive Garati student called Torvin cleaned his four-clawed hands with obvious boredom, and his thick armored hide made him look like a living tank. Meraxi, the serpentine Vithalan, coiled in her seat and reviewed data on her tablet, while her forked tongue tasted the recycled air of the shuttle instructor. Valorith stood at the front of the cabin, and his tall insectoid body swayed with the motion of the ship as he addressed the class. Students, we are about to land on Verdaxis 7 for our 3-day xenobiology observation expedition, he announced in his clicking voice. This planet has been designated a Class 2 Wilderness Preserve, and you will have the opportunity to document native fauna in their natural habitat. Una listened carefully while the other students shifted in their seats with varying degrees of interest and anxiety. She was the only human at the academy, and after 6 months, she had grown used to being the odd one out. Her plain brown eyes and soft skin made her look weak compared to the armored, scaled, and exoskeleton-covered bodies of her classmates. Valorith continued his briefing, and his compound eyes swept across the cabin. Safety protocols are essential, he said. Verdaxis 7 hosts several apex predators, but all dangerous species are confined to designated zones far from our observation area and the protective barriers around our camp will keep us completely secure. The shuttle touched down with a gentle bump, and the doors slid open to reveal a world of silver and gold. Una stepped out onto soft purple moss and breathed air that smelled like copper and honey. The twin suns hung low on the horizon and cast long shadows through the metallic forest, and strange bird-like creatures called out from the canopy. Above us, Earl emerged behind her, and the small Ethone moved with careful, delicate steps as if the ground might break beneath her. Is it true that your homeworld has even more dangerous creatures than this place? Cyril asked in her soft musical voice. Before Una could answer, Torvin pushed past them both, and his heavy footsteps crushed the moss beneath his weight. Do not waste your time asking the human about danger, he said with a dismissive grunt. Her species has no claws, no venom, no armor, and no natural weapons of any kind. And I have read that they cannot even see in the dark. Una felt the familiar sting of his words, but she kept her expression calm. She had heard similar comments many times since arriving at the academy. We survived anyway, she said simply. Torvin laughed, and the sound was harsh and mocking. Through luck and nothing more, he said. Your species is barely 1,000 years into space travel, while mine has sailed the stars for 50,000. And you are children playing in a galaxy of adults. Meraxi slithered up beside them, and her yellow eyes studied Una with scientific curiosity. I find humans fascinating, actually, she said. The statistics about your homeworld are remarkable, and I have read that Earth has more venomous species than any other known inhabited planet. Everything that wants to kill everything else. Una agreed. We learned to adapt. Valarth called the students together and assigned them scanning equipment for documenting the local wildlife. Una received her device and moved toward the edge of the camp where the silver trees grew thick and mysterious. The work was peaceful, and she spent the next few hours recording images of six-winged insects and small burrowing creatures with too many eyes. Cyril found her way to us. Una sighed as the twin suns began to set and the Ethone's glow provided soft light in the gathering darkness. May I ask you something personal? Cyril said quietly. Of course. What was Earth really like? Cyril asked. The databases describe it as a death world, but the descriptions seem almost exaggerated, and I find it difficult to believe any species could evolve in such conditions. Una considered the question while she watched the shadows lengthen between the trees. The databases are accurate, she said. We had predators that could outrun us and predators that could overpower us and predators that could poison us with a single bite. And we had weather that could freeze us or burn us or drown us, and we had diseases that killed millions, and we had 1,000 ways to die before we ever reached adulthood. Cyril's bioluminescence flickered with something like fear. How did your species survive? She whispered. Una smiled, and it was a strange expression that Cyril could not quite interpret. We got stubborn about it, Una said. We decided we would not die, and then we figured out how to make that true. The camp lights activated as full darkness fell, and the protective barrier hummed to life around their observation. Post students gathered near the central shelter and shared data from their afternoon scans. And Valorith reviewed their findings with pleased clicking sounds. Una sat apart from the group and watched the tree line with quiet attention. Something felt different about the forest now that night had come, and she could not identify what had changed, but her instincts whispered warnings. She had learned never to ignore Valorith's communicator chimed, and he stepped away from the students to take the message. Ana watched his body language shift from relaxed to tense, and his antennae flattened against his head in a gesture she had learned meant concern. When he returned to the group, his voice was carefully controlled. Students, I must inform you of a minor situation, he said. Our perimeter sensors have detected movement in a zone that should be empty, and I am certain it is nothing to worry about, but I want you all to remain within the barrier tonight. Torvin straightened his massive frame and looked almost eager. What kind of movement? He demanded. Velith hesitated, and Una saw the flash of real worry in his compound eyes. A containment field in the northern sector appears to have failed, he admitted. We are investigating, but for now we follow safety protocols and stay inside our protected area." The students exchanged nervous glances, and Cyril's glow dimmed to almost nothing as fear overtook her. Yuna rose from her seat and walked to the edge of the barrier, where she could see into the darkness beyond. The silver trees stood silent and still, but somewhere out there something was moving toward them. She had felt this before on camping trips in the wilderness of Earth. When the night went quiet and the prey animals stopped calling because something dangerous had entered the area, she did not know what hunted on Verdaxis 7, but she knew the feeling of being watched by something that saw her as food. Yuna turned back to look at her alien classmates with their armor and their claws and their venom, and she wondered if any of them understood what was coming. They had evolved on safe worlds where the greatest threats had been eliminated long ago, and they had never learned to read the silence of a forest that had gone still with fear. She had, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that tonight would test all of them in ways none of them expected.